In November 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter knelt in front of a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and chipped a small hole through it. He held up a candle. Behind him, his patron Lord Carnarvon asked if he could see anything. Carter's answer became one of the most quoted lines in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. What lay beyond that doorway was the almost entirely intact tomb of a minor pharaoh who had died young and been buried in a hurry, and yet it turned out to be the single richest royal burial ever found in Egypt. Chariots, thrones, statues, weapons, board games, and more than 5,000 individual objects were crammed into 4 small rooms. But the object that would eventually become the most recognized face on the planet was still 3 coffins deep, wrapped against the chest of a mummified teenager. A solid gold death mask weighing about 11 kilograms, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise, and colored glass. For most of the 20th century, that mask was treated as a closed case. It was Tutankhamun's mask, made for Tutankhamun, full stop. It appeared on stamps on museum posters on the cover of magazines, and eventually on a world tour that turned King Tut into a household phrase. But archaeologists who spent real time with the object kept noticing small things that didn't sit right. And starting in earnest in the 2010s, those small things turned into one of the more genuinely contentious debates in modern Egyptology, a debate that is, as of today, still not settled. This is that story, and it deserves to be told accurately because the truth is strange enough without needing to be exaggerated. To understand why anyone doubts the mask, you first have to understand the circumstances of Tutankhamun's death and burial. He became king around the age of 9, ruled for roughly a decade, and died at about 18 or 19 years old. The exact cause has been debated for a century. Theories have ranged from a chariot accident to a combination of malaria and a badly broken leg that became infected. But almost everyone agrees on one thing: his death was not planned for. Egyptian royal tombs typically took years, sometimes decades, to prepare. Tutankhamun's tomb, by contrast, is small. Uncomfortably small for a king. Some art historians have long suspected it wasn't originally built to be a royal tomb at all, but a lesser structure, perhaps intended for a noble or even repurposed from something else, because there simply wasn't time to carve a proper pharaoh's resting place from scratch. The artifacts inside tell a similar story. Egyptologists cataloging the tomb over the decades noticed that a number of objects buried with Tutankhamun appear to have been made for someone else first and adapted for him afterward. Some canopic equipment, coffinettes, and other funerary items show traces of names that were altered, cartouches recarved, in some cases more than once, as if objects were recycled from one royal burial to another during a period when several rulers died in quick succession. This wasn't a scandal invented by modern researchers. It's something Egyptologists have written about for a long time, because ancient Egyptian workshops really did reuse royal grave goods when circumstances demanded it. The question that mattered was whether the golden mask, the single most iconic object in the entire find, was one of those repurposed items. The specific clue that reopened the case is almost absurdly small when you first hear it, and that's part of what makes it compelling. The ears on Tutankhamun's mask are pierced, with visible holes clearly designed to hold earrings. On its own, that might seem unremarkable. Earrings are earrings. But Egyptologists who study royal iconography point out that adult male pharaohs are essentially never depicted in official funerary art with pierced ears. In the artistic conventions of the New Kingdom, pierced ears show up almost exclusively on images of children and on some queens and female rulers. A grown king, shown in his eternal, idealized state for the afterlife, wasn't supposed to be wearing jewelry associated with childhood or with women. British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves was the researcher who pushed this observation furthest and first turned it into a public theory in 2015. Reeves had been closely re-examining the mask and noticed something else in addition to the ears. It's actually built from 2 separate pieces of gold. The face is a distinct panel, joined to the rest of the headdress and collar, which was itself a fairly common construction technique for Egyptian masks of that quality. But Reeves argued the 2 pieces here didn't originate together. He pointed to what he described as a slightly different alloy composition between the face and the surrounding headdress, and to soldering and joinery on the back of the mask that, in his reading, looked like evidence of a later modification rather than an original single design. Combine that with the pierced ears, and Reeves proposed a specific and startling idea. The mask's headdress, collar, and ears were originally made for a different, female ruler, and only the face itself was made fresh for Tutankhamun, grafted onto an existing piece. Reeves didn't leave the theory vague. He named a candidate, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun's stepmother, one of the most famous royal women in Egyptian history thanks to her painted limestone bust, and a figure whose final years are genuinely one of the great open mysteries of the period. Nefertiti was the chief wife of the heretic king Akhenaten, who tried to radically remake Egyptian religion around the worship of a single sun god, the Aten. After Akhenaten's death, the historical record around Nefertiti gets murky. Many Egyptologists believe she may have ruled Egypt in her own right for a period, possibly under the throne name Neferneferuiten, before Tutankhamun took the throne as a child. Her tomb has never been identified. Her mummy has never been conclusively found. That gap in a record is precisely why she keeps surfacing in theories like this one. She is a documented, powerful, near-contemporary royal figure who essentially vanishes from the archaeological record at just the moment a body double for the mask would need to exist. Reeves's argument, in short, was this: if Nefertiti, as Neferneferuiten, died and had funerary equipment, including a mask, prepared for her own burial, and if Tutankhamun then died unexpectedly a short time later with no royal mask of his own ready, the fastest solution for the burial priests racing a strict ritual deadline would have been to take her mask, plug the earring holes, replace her face with his, and recarve the inscriptions. It's an efficient, almost bureaucratic explanation for a set of odd physical features, and that's exactly why it caught on with the public as well as with some scholars. Here's the part that often gets left out of viral retellings, and it matters enormously. Reeves's mask theory has real, credentialed critics, and has not become the consensus position in Egyptology. The most direct challenge came from Christian Ekman, the German conservator who led the international team that physically examined and repaired the mask up close, including during a well-documented 2015 restoration project. Ekman's team used X-ray fluorescence analysis to study the gold in different sections of the mask. According to his published findings, the construction from two main gold pieces was a normal, standard practice for masks of this kind in that era, not a sign of tampering. He also stated that he found no physical evidence that the face had been cut away from an original and replaced, no detectable trace of the kind of alteration Reeves proposed. On the pierced ear question specifically, other Egyptologists have pointed out that royal mummies, including Tutankhamun's own body, do show evidence of pierced ears, and that it wasn't necessarily as exclusively feminine a feature as Reeves suggested. Some scholars argue young kings may have worn earrings before adulthood, and that this could be reflected in funerary imagery without requiring the mask to belong to someone else. In other words, credentialed experts looked at the very same physical evidence Reeves used and came away with the opposite interpretation. That's not spin. That's what a live, unresolved academic dispute actually looks like. Both sides have published, both sides have specific technical justifications, and no side has produced a piece of evidence decisive enough to end the argument. Reeves didn't stop at the mask. In the same period, he extended his theory dramatically, arguing that the layout of Tutankhamun's tomb itself contained architectural evidence of hidden, sealed doorways behind painted walls, and that what lay behind them could be the still undiscovered burial chamber of Nefertiti herself. This is a separate claim from the mask theory, but the two became linked in public discussion because they came from the same researcher and pointed toward the same missing queen. The tomb theory led to real, on-the-ground fieldwork. In 2015 and 2016, ground-penetrating radar surveys were carried out inside the tomb, first by the Japanese radar specialist Hirokatsu Watanabe, whose initial readings were reported as showing signs of voids behind the walls consistent with Reeves's theory. That announcement made international news and briefly seemed to confirm the idea that Nefertiti's tomb might be sitting undiscovered just meters away. However, subsequent independent radar surveys, including a more rigorous scan led by American geophysicist Dean Goodman for National Geographic in 2018, using data reviewed by multiple outside specialists, found no evidence of hidden chambers or voids behind the tomb walls. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities eventually stated that the scans did not support the existence of hidden rooms, and the tomb chamber version of Reeves's theory is now widely regarded by most Egyptologists as unconfirmed at best and effectively disproven at worst. It's a useful reminder that a compelling theory and a proven discovery are two very different things, and that this field, like any scientific field, corrects itself when new data comes in, sometimes against the very theory that inspired the search in the first place. The mask debate didn't end with Ekman's 2015 analysis. Years later, a research team associated with the University of York, working with Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher, revisited the pierced-ear evidence and the construction of the mask independently, without simply accepting either Reeves's or Ekman's prior conclusions. Their analysis again drew attention to the mask's soldering and the visible seam where the face meets the rest of the headdress, describing what they characterized as clear evidence of the face having been joined onto an already existing piece. Language some of the researchers used evoked the idea of Tutankhamun's features being grafted onto a mask that had first been built for someone else. Fletcher, in public comments, was careful to frame this as an open possibility rather than a certainty, noting that the original owner could have been a woman, and that Nefertiti remains the leading candidate simply because of the historical gap around her death and burial, but not because there's a name, an inscription, or a fingerprint tying the mask to her specifically. This more recent look reopened public interest in the theory, and once again drew a response from skeptics who hold that the two-piece construction and even the soldering pattern are consistent with normal 18th dynasty craftsmanship, not evidence of reuse. So even with a fresh set of eyes and years of additional scholarship, the debate has landed in almost exactly the same place it started. A genuinely interesting anomaly, a plausible and historically grounded hypothesis, and no conclusive physical proof either way. Part of what makes this such a durable controversy is the nature of the evidence involved. Nobody is willing to disassemble or damage one of the most famous and fragile artifacts on Earth just to settle an academic argument, which means researchers are limited to non-invasive techniques, surface examination, X-ray fluorescence, careful visual analysis of joins and seams, and comparison with other royal artifacts from the same period. Each of these methods has real limitations. X-ray fluorescence can tell you a great deal about the chemical composition of gold at the surface, but it can struggle to definitively distinguish between two pieces of gold that were alloyed similarly, especially if ancient goldsmiths deliberately worked to make a graft look seamless, something we know Egyptian craftsmen were skilled enough to attempt. Visual analysis of soldering and joins is also somewhat subjective. Two trained conservators, looking at the same seam, have reached different conclusions about what it means, as Ekman's and the York team's differing readings show. What would actually settle this, most Egyptologists agree, is either the discovery of Nefertiti's actual tomb and remains, which would let researchers compare grave goods, artistic style, and possibly DNA, or a future non-destructive imaging technique sensitive enough to distinguish metal that has been reworked from metal that was cast once and left alone. That's not science fiction. That kind of higher-resolution materials analysis is an active area of research in archaeometallurgy, even if nothing on Tutankhamun's mask specifically has produced that kind of definitive answer yet. Until then, the mask sits in the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, on public display, and the plaque next to it still describes it as Tutankhamun's own. It's worth pausing on why this matters beyond mass trivia. If Reeves and Fletcher are right, it reshapes how we think about the transition of power at the end of the 18th dynasty, a genuinely chaotic stretch of Egyptian history that included Akhenaten's religious revolution, the mysterious rule of Nefertiti, the brief reign of a shadowy figure named Smenkhare, Tutankhamun's restoration of traditional religion as a child king, and the rapid consolidation of power afterward by officials like Ai and the general Hormheb. Several objects from Tutankhamun's tomb are already accepted by mainstream Egyptology as having originally belonged to Smenkhare or to Nefertiti and were adapted for the boy king's burial. This isn't a fringe idea in general. It's documented practice for this specific chaotic period of succession. The debate isn't really about whether royal funerary goods were ever recycled in this era. They clearly were. It's specifically about whether the single most famous object from the tomb, the mask itself, was one of them. If the mask does turn out to have been originally intended for Nefertiti, it wouldn't just be a curiosity about metalwork. It would be physical, material evidence connecting the world's most recognizable ancient artifact directly to one of history's most compelling missing figures, a queen who may have ruled Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, and then disappeared so completely from the record that her tomb, body, and even her final name remain genuinely unknown more than 3,000 years later. That's a legitimately dramatic possibility, and it doesn't need any invented technology to be interesting. It only needs the real evidence, argued honestly by people who disagree with each other in good faith. As of now, there is no consensus. Nicholas Reeves and Joanne Fletcher's teams maintain that the physical evidence points toward the mask having been made first for a female ruler, most likely Nefertiti, and later adapted for Tutankhamun under the pressure of his unexpected death. Christian Ekman and a number of other Egyptologists maintain that the two-piece construction and joinery are consistent with standard practice for the period, and that there is no conclusive evidence the face was ever swapped. The related theory that Nefertiti's undiscovered tomb lies hidden behind Tutankhamun's burial chamber has been substantially weakened by follow-up radar surveys that found no supporting evidence, even though the initial 2015 scans seem to suggest otherwise. What hasn't changed is the mask itself, still on display, still drawing enormous crowds, still one of the most photographed objects in the world, and still, after more than a century of study and multiple rounds of high-tech analysis, not fully explained. Nefertiti's tomb has never been found. Her mummy has never been positively identified. And every few years, a new piece of research reopens the same question that Nicholas Reeves first asked out loud in 2015. Whose face is Tutankhamun's mask really wearing? Maybe someday a new imaging technique, a lucky excavation, or a DNA match will finally settle it one way or the other. Until then, this remains exactly what it is, not a hidden conspiracy uncovered by secret technology, but a real, open, and genuinely fascinating scholarly disagreement playing out in journals and conference halls about one of the most famous